In the heart of Prague, in the year 1868, the city was alive with the quiet hum of everyday life. Streets cobbled with uneven stones echoed under the hurried steps of merchants and townsfolk, while the Vltava river reflected the muted colors of early autumn. Yet, amid this seemingly ordinary day, an unnatural sound disturbed the rhythm of the city, a bell tolling when no one had rung it. The bell tower, a centuries-old structure of weathered stone and darkened timbers, had stood for generations as a silent guardian, its presence both reassuring and formidable. The townspeople had grown accustomed to its familiar chimes marking the passing hours, yet this day the bell's voice rang out without reason, resonating across the narrow streets with a weight that seemed almost tangible. No one could explain why it rang. The tower, as sturdy as it appeared, bore no signs of intruders. The heavy bell, forged long ago by skilled hands, required a forceful pull to set it in motion, yet it had swung freely, as if moved by an unseen hand. Some claimed the wind had carried it, but there had been no gust strong enough to lift the massive bronze. Others whispered of mechanical failure, imagining hidden levers and ropes snapping or shifting on their own. Still, the intensity and rhythm of the tolling suggested something deliberate, intentional, and profoundly unnatural. By the time the final peal faded, the town had fallen into an uneasy silence, punctuated only by the distant calls of crows circling above the rooftops. Residents of the nearby quarters emerged cautiously from their homes, faces pale, eyes scanning the skies and streets for any sign of explanation. Mothers clutched their children closer, and elderly men muttered prayers under their breath, as if invoking protection against a force they could not see. The bell's sound, though not loud enough to shatter windows, carried an emotional weight that seemed to bypass rational thought. It was a sound that awakened something primitive, a resonance that spoke to fear rather than reason. People felt it deep in their bones, a vibration that seemed to hum through the cobblestones themselves. Even those who prided themselves on logic found themselves shivering, caught between disbelief and dread. Word spread quickly, as it always did in a city like Prague, where news traveled faster than the river current. By noon, whispers had transformed into full-fledged speculation. "It is the work of devils," one shopkeeper claimed, eyes wide with panic. "The dead are walking among us," a street vendor insisted, pointing vaguely toward the tower as if he could already sense the unseen presence that had rung the bell. Skeptics dismissed these tales, asserting that fear had clouded judgment, yet even the most rational citizens could not deny the extraordinary nature of what had occurred. The bell had tolled with a precision and weight that defied natural causes, and its echoes lingered long after the sound itself had ceased, embedding a sense of foreboding into the very air of the city. In the following hours, attempts were made to investigate the tower. Local authorities, accompanied by craftsmen familiar with the mechanisms of such bells, ascended the narrow, spiraling staircases that led to the upper chambers. Each step creaked underfoot, amplifying the tension that clung to the stone walls. The bell itself hung in solemn silence, unmarked and unyielding. The ropes and pulleys that controlled its movement appeared intact, untouched by human hands. Nothing in the chamber suggested a fault, nothing suggested tampering. It was as if the bell had moved under the command of some unseen force, a phantom conductor orchestrating a sound that no mortal could produce. The investigators exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of their confusion evident in furrowed brows and lingering glances toward the darkened corners of the tower. As night approached, a dense fog began to roll in from the river, enveloping the city in a soft, gray shroud. The bell tower, once a familiar silhouette against the twilight sky, now loomed with an ominous presence. Candlelight flickered in the windows of nearby homes, casting trembling shadows that danced across the streets. Those who had remained close to the tower described a sense of being watched, a subtle movement just beyond the edges of vision. Some reported hearing the faintest echoes of the bell even after it had stopped, an auditory residue that clung to the fog in the buildings. Anxiety thickened in the air, settling like a heavy cloak over the city, making the simple act of breathing feel weighted. By midnight, Prague had fallen into a restless slumber, yet the incident continued to haunt the thoughts of its citizens. Dreams were troubled, even the deepest sleepers awoke with a sense of foreboding and an unshakable image of the bell's dark silhouette against the misted sky. Children cried out in sleep, speaking of shadowy figures and strange ringing, while adults questioned their own senses, wondering if the day's events had been real or a shared hallucination brought on by collective unease. The bell, silent now, had already begun to carve its mark into the psyche of the city, leaving questions that could not be answered and fears that could not be ignored. By dawn, a crowd had gathered at the base of the tower, murmuring in hushed tones and casting wary glances upward. Scholars and clergy were called upon to interpret the inexplicable event, offering theories that ranged from the mechanical to the supernatural. None could provide a satisfying explanation. The bell had tolled without cause, and its sound had left an indelible imprint on the city's consciousness. What began as a single, unaccountable incident had evolved into a mystery that would ripple through Prague for months, setting the stage for further anomalies and darker revelations. Even as life gradually resumed its normal rhythm, the memory of that first toll would linger, a haunting prelude to the strange and unsettling events yet to come. Prague in 1868 was a city of contrasts, where history and modernity intertwined along the winding streets and across the bridges spanning the Vltava River. The skyline was punctuated by spires and towers, each telling a story of faith, power, and artistry. Among these architectural marvels, the bell towers held a particular significance. They were not merely instruments of timekeeping or ceremonial display, they were the heartbeat of the city, marking the rhythms of daily life with a resonance that connected every resident to a shared temporal pulse. Merchants relied on the bells to signal market openings, schoolchildren timed their lessons by the chimes, and the faithful counted on them to call the community to worship. Each tower had a history as layered and intricate as the city itself, and the one that had tolled mysteriously in 1868 was no exception. The bell tower that now haunted the memories of Prague's citizens had stood for centuries, a monument to craftsmanship and devotion. Its stones, darkened by time and weather, were etched with inscriptions that chronicled the generosity of those who had funded its construction. The massive bell, cast from bronze and engraved with intricate patterns, bore the marks of skilled artisans whose identities were recorded in faded archives. It had been a gift to the city, a symbol of communal pride and divine guardianship. Generations had grown up under its tolling, never questioning the comfort it brought, until that day in 1868 when it rang alone, defying all logic. To understand the significance of the bell's behavior, one must first grasp the role of bell towers in Prague's social and spiritual life. These towers were more than architectural feats, they were symbols of authority and continuity. Each ringing communicated information, both mundane and profound. In times of crisis, bells could signal danger, summon aid, or announce tragedy. In times of celebration, they marked victories, weddings, and the arrival of new life. The tonal quality of a bell was studied and revered, for a single bell could influence the mood of the surrounding community. Its voice could comfort, warn, or inspire awe, making it an instrument with both practical and psychological power. The mysterious ringing in 1868 was therefore not just an anomaly, it was a rupture in the city's very rhythm, a disturbance that unsettled both body and mind. The tower itself was constructed with meticulous attention to detail, reflecting the Gothic and Baroque influences that shaped Prague's skyline. Narrow staircases wound upward through stone walls, leading to the belfry where the massive bell hung suspended above a wooden frame reinforced with iron fittings. Over centuries, countless caretakers had maintained the tower, ensuring that the mechanisms functioned smoothly and that the bell remained responsive to human touch. Its ropes were strong, its pulleys precise, and its swing predictable, an object as dependable as the sun rising over the Charles Bridge. Yet, in 1868, this dependable instrument acted with an autonomy that no engineer or craftsman could have foreseen. The bell's anomalous tolling was even more unsettling because it occurred during a period of social flux. Prague was a city in transition, straddling the line between old traditions and emerging modern sensibilities. Political debates, the influence of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and rapid urban development had created an undercurrent of tension throughout the city. People were aware of their own vulnerability, both physically and socially, and any unexplained event could easily be interpreted through the lens of fear. In such an environment, the tolling of the bell was more than a mere oddity, it was a symbol of uncertainty, a reminder that even the familiar could betray reason. Residents who had lived near the tower for decades described the building with reverence and subtle fear. They spoke of its shadow stretching across the streets in the late afternoon, darkening windows and alleyways. They recalled how the sound of the bell could be felt as much as heard, a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very ground, touching the bones of those who stood below. The tower was a constant presence in their lives, so integral that its silence would have been unsettling, but its sudden, unexplained ringing was outright terrifying. Scholars and chroniclers later documented the atmosphere of tension and unease that gripped the neighborhood, noting how even ordinary routines, baking bread, walking to the market, or attending evening prayers, were overshadowed by a sense of apprehension. The cultural and spiritual significance of the bell compounded the sense of mystery. Bells in Prague were often consecrated, believed to carry blessings and protective powers. They were inscribed with prayers and invocations, and their ringing was thought to ward off evil or summon divine guidance. To hear such a bell toll without cause was, therefore, not only confusing but deeply unsettling on a metaphysical level. It challenged the community's understanding of cause and effect, bridging the gap between the natural and supernatural in a way that left people questioning both their faith and their rationality. As evening descended, the streets around the tower became quiet, but the memory of the bells tolling persisted. Windows were shuttered, lamps lit, and doors bolted as if to guard against a force that could not be seen. Conversations in hushed tones revolved around what had been heard, blending historical knowledge, folklore, and speculation. Some suggested a mechanical explanation, citing age and wear, while others hinted at curses or restless spirits. The city's historians and clergy began to prepare accounts for future reference, knowing that this event would demand explanation and that it might, in time, become part of Prague's ever-growing tapestry of stories that straddled the line between history and legend. By nightfall, the bell tower had transformed from a symbol of civic pride into a focal point of fear and fascination. Its history, once a source of stability, now loomed as a silent witness to a phenomenon that defied comprehension. The city had been reminded of the fragility of its understanding, the limitations of reason, and the persistence of the unknown. In that moment, the bell was no longer simply a bell. It had become an enigmatic force, a herald of questions that would echo through the cobblestone streets of Prague long after the day had ended, ensuring that the memory of its mysterious tolling would be carried forward by every witness, skeptic, and storyteller for years to come. As the weeks passed following the inexplicable tolling of the bell, the residents of Prague began to notice subtle changes in their surroundings, small anomalies that would soon grow into something far more disturbing. What had initially seemed like an isolated incident at the bell tower became a thread woven into the fabric of daily life, as if the city itself were responding to a hidden and malevolent rhythm. People reported hearing faint echoes of the bell even on calm, windless days, whispers of sound that seemed to originate from nowhere. Those who ventured near the tower described a heaviness in the air, a sensation that pressed against their chests and made it difficult to breathe. Even the sunlight filtering through the fog seemed muted, as though the world had been draped in a subtle, ominous haze designed to dampen hope and clarity. Whispers began in the narrow alleyways and quiet courtyards, traveling faster than the tolls themselves. Children playing in the streets would pause suddenly, their games interrupted by an unseen presence or a shiver of fear, and mothers would pull them close, uneasy in the face of a threat they could not identify. Shopkeepers recounted strange disturbances, loose tools, small items moved from their shelves, and an unshakable sense of being watched while serving customers. Even the city guards, trained in both observation and skepticism, could not dismiss the odd occurrences entirely. They began to patrol the area around the bell tower more frequently, though their presence offered little reassurance, for the disturbances persisted with a persistence that seemed beyond natural explanation. The early signs of anomaly were often dismissed as coincidence or overactive imagination, yet the pattern grew too consistent to ignore. Each instance seemed to revolve around the bell tower, its shadow stretching across streets and rooftops in ways that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Residents described hearing faint steps in empty corridors, doors creaking open on their own, and soft, distant voices murmuring unintelligible words. There were reports of pets behaving erratically, dogs barking at corners of rooms where no one stood, and cats refusing to approach certain doorways. These subtle but persistent signs sowed seeds of anxiety, leaving the townspeople on edge, waiting for some larger revelation to emerge from the growing darkness. The most unnerving aspect was the bell's apparent awareness of the human presence. It seemed to toll in response to events or individuals, as though measuring fear, curiosity, or guilt. On some nights, it rang just after a heated argument or a personal loss, its sound perfectly timed to unsettle and amplify the emotional weight of the moment. Scholars and priests visiting the tower attempted to reconcile this pattern with rational explanations, but none could find cause for the selective nature of the phenomenon. Theories ranged from natural acoustic anomalies caused by shifting air currents to more fantastical notions of spiritual interference, yet the experiences of witnesses resisted categorization. The bell had become an actor in its own right, a silent orchestrator of unease whose intentions remained inscrutable. Local folklore began to intertwine with these modern accounts, enriching the mystery with centuries-old superstition. Stories of restless spirits, old curses, and guardians of the city who communicated through sacred objects resurfaced in whispered conversations. Older residents recounted tales of similar occurrences centuries earlier, when bells had supposedly tolled to warn of impending misfortune or to signal the presence of the supernatural. These stories, once relegated to bedtime narratives or church sermons, took on new significance in light of recent events. They offered context and partial explanations but did little to provide comfort, as the modern experiences were vividly immediate, leaving no room for detachment or dismissal. The psychological impact on the community grew in both subtle and profound ways. People began to change their routines, avoiding the streets around the bell tower at night and limiting gatherings that might provoke its attention. Anxiety and suspicion seeped into daily interactions, with neighbors eyeing one another warily, unsure who might be sensitive to or connected with the mysterious tolling. The collective consciousness of the city became saturated with fear and uncertainty, creating a feedback loop in which the mere anticipation of the bell could trigger physical and emotional responses. Even those who had initially approached the mystery with skepticism found themselves increasingly drawn into the narrative, their curiosity mingled with unease. Reports from first witnesses intensified the drama surrounding the bell tower. Individuals claimed to see figures in the mist, shadowy silhouettes lingering near windows or on rooftops. Some swore that the bell tolled in response to their own thoughts, its sound echoing what they feared or desired most. Others described inexplicable movements within their homes, furniture shifting, candles extinguishing spontaneously, and faint, almost imperceptible knocks from empty rooms. These experiences were never violent, yet their subtlety only amplified their effectiveness. The terror lay in what was unseen, in the suggestion of forces just beyond the edge of perception. The human mind, naturally attuned to narrative and pattern, began to weave the evidence into a coherent, if terrifying, story, one that implied the presence of intelligence or intention behind the bell's behavior. As these anomalies became more frequent, the atmosphere around the bell tower shifted. Streets once bustling with activity grew quieter, and the fog seemed to linger longer, wrapping the city in an almost sentient cloak of unease. Candlelight flickered uncertainly in homes as if sensing the tension in the air. Even the river, which had always mirrored the city's life with serene constancy, appeared darker and more foreboding, reflecting the subtle changes in human behavior and perception. Public spaces, such as markets and plazas, were approached with caution, and gatherings were shortened, conversation muted, as if the community collectively acknowledged that something beyond understanding was at work. Attempts to document these experiences produced a fragmented record, composed of diary entries, letters, and local accounts that often conflicted in detail but converged in tone. Fear, uncertainty, and fascination were the dominant themes. Observers noted the bell's tendency to toll unpredictably, sometimes during moments of intense emotional significance or communal events, and sometimes in the quietest hours of the night. The layering of these experiences created an emotional texture that was dense, palpable, and deeply affecting. The bell had become a nexus of suspense and dread, a physical and psychological focal point that tied the city's inhabitants to an event they could neither control nor fully comprehend. By the end of the season, it was clear that the bell tower was no longer merely a background feature of Prague. It had become a character in the city's ongoing narrative, one whose influence reached into homes, workplaces, and public spaces alike. Residents began to measure time and action in relation to the bell, even when it remained silent, and the anticipation of its sound created a tension that pervaded daily life. The community's collective consciousness had been altered, its perceptions sharpened and its fears amplified, setting the stage for events that would escalate beyond mere anomaly into something far more unsettling and irreversible. The unease that had settled over Prague following the mysterious tolling of the bell in 1868 began to manifest in more tangible and alarming ways. Residents who had grown accustomed to subtle anomalies now faced events that could not be dismissed as coincidence or superstition. One of the most shocking occurrences involved the sudden disappearance of a prominent figure in the community, a man whose presence had long been intertwined with the life of the neighborhood. He was a respected merchant, known for his meticulous nature and unwavering routine. Each day, he could be seen opening his shop promptly at dawn, arranging goods with precision, and greeting neighbors with calm familiarity. Yet, one morning, as the fog rolled thickly along the cobblestone streets, he simply did not appear. His absence was first noted by those who relied on him daily. Customers arrived at his shop, only to find the door locked and the interior empty. Concerned inquiries to neighboring residents were met with uncertainty, and rumors began to circulate rapidly. Some claimed that he had been taken by illness, though no evidence supported this. Others whispered darker possibilities, suggesting that the bell's mysterious tolling had summoned him or that he had become entangled with forces beyond human comprehension. The disappearance was unsettling precisely because it defied all normal explanations. The man's habits had been so predictable, his life so orderly, that his absence could only be interpreted as a profound rupture in the expected flow of reality. In the days following his disappearance, the community grew increasingly anxious. Friends and family organized searches, combing the streets, riverbanks, and surrounding countryside for any sign of him. The authorities were called, but even seasoned officers were confounded. The merchant's home was intact, there were no signs of struggle or forced entry. His belongings remained in place, untouched, suggesting that he had left voluntarily, or had been taken by a force that left no trace. The bell tower, looming nearby, became a focal point for speculation. Some residents claimed to see shadows moving in its upper chambers at odd hours, while others insisted that the tolling had occurred precisely when the disappearance was first noticed, as though the bell itself marked the event with its resonant voice. The psychological impact of the disappearance was profound. The merchant had been a figure of stability, a person whose very routine reinforced the sense of normalcy in the neighborhood. His absence created a void, not only in the physical landscape but in the collective consciousness of the townspeople. Anxiety became pervasive, coloring daily interactions with a shadow of suspicion and fear. Neighbors watched one another more closely, uncertain whether someone's involvement in the disappearance might be hidden behind polite smiles and customary greetings. Children, too young to fully understand, sensed the tension in the air, their playfulness subdued by the unspoken weight that had settled over the streets. As the search continued, a series of strange coincidences began to emerge. Witnesses reported hearing the bell toll at times when no one was present to ring it, and each toll seemed linked to a location or event that corresponded, in some subtle way, to the merchant's routines. The baker's bell above his shop would echo faintly with the same rhythm as the mysterious tolls from the tower, leading some to believe that the sound itself carried a message or a signal, guiding or manipulating the course of events. Scholars and clergy who examined the phenomenon attempted to impose structure upon it, analyzing timing, acoustics, and historical patterns, but the irregularity and precision of the tolling resisted explanation. The pattern suggested intelligence, intent, or even malevolent awareness. Stories from witnesses began to accumulate, forming a network of eerie accounts that added layers to the unfolding mystery. One young apprentice claimed to have seen a figure near the tower in the early hours of the disappearance, shrouded in mist, moving with unnatural quiet. Another reported hearing whispered words that seemed to echo from the belfry, indecipherable yet imbued with urgency. The combination of visual, auditory, and circumstantial anomalies made the event feel orchestrated, as though the city itself had been drawn into a larger, unseen narrative. Residents began to speculate that the bell tower had a consciousness of its own, one capable of influencing human behavior and determining outcomes according to an inscrutable design. The missing merchant's family, meanwhile, faced the kind of dread that no logical reasoning could alleviate. They spoke of feelings that something unseen had intervened in his life, of dreams where the bell tolled incessantly, each peal seeming to punctuate a warning they could not interpret. These dreams were not uniform but varied in intensity and content, yet all shared a common thread, the presence of the bell and the sensation of being watched or directed by forces beyond their understanding. Their grief was compounded by uncertainty. There was no body, no explanation, no closure. In Prague, this uncertainty fed into the broader narrative of fear that had already begun to suffuse the city in the wake of the bell's inexplicable activity. Religious authorities attempted to intervene, offering prayers, blessings, and rituals intended to counteract whatever influence might have been at work. Public gatherings were organized to address communal fear, but even these measures were met with mixed reactions. Some residents found solace in ritual and collective observance, while others interpreted the interventions as impotent, evidence that the forces behind the bell's tolling and the disappearance were impervious to human control. The tension between faith and reason became a recurring theme, as citizens struggled to reconcile what they could see, hear, and feel with what they believed to be possible. By the end of the month, the disappearance had not only unsettled the immediate neighborhood but had begun to ripple across Prague more broadly. Travelers and merchants spoke of the events with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, adding their own interpretations and embellishments to the story. Newspapers hinted at odd occurrences in the city, careful to avoid outright panic but unable to ignore the growing sense that something extraordinary and inexplicable was unfolding. The bell tower, already a symbol of civic pride and historical continuity, had become a locus of mystery and dread, its presence reshaping perception and stirring imaginations in ways that no physical or rational explanation could fully contain. In time, the missing merchant would return, but his absence had left an indelible mark. The city's collective consciousness had been altered, sensitized to subtle anomalies and receptive to the possibility that the bell tower was more than mere architecture. The disappearance was the first of many events that would escalate the sense of menace surrounding the tower, establishing a pattern of fear, curiosity, and psychological strain that would shape the unfolding narrative. It was a moment in which reality and perception began to blur, and in which the citizens of Prague were forced to confront the unsettling notion that the world they had thought familiar might, in fact, harbor forces beyond their comprehension. When the missing merchant finally returned to Prague, the relief of friends and family was tempered by an unsettling sense that he was not entirely the same man who had disappeared. He appeared suddenly one morning, walking along the familiar cobblestone streets as if emerging from a fog, his eyes distant and his movements measured in a way that suggested a lingering unfamiliarity with the world around him. At first, neighbors rejoiced, offering greetings and questions about his absence, but their smiles faltered as they noticed the subtle changes in his demeanor. There was an odd stillness to his expression, a measured cadence in his speech, and a reluctance to discuss his experiences. The man who had once been so present in the daily rhythm of the city seemed now to carry with him a weight far beyond ordinary comprehension. Immediately, rumors began to swirl regarding the nature of his disappearance. Some insisted that he had encountered the supernatural, that the bell tower itself had reached out and claimed him for reasons known only to some hidden force. Others speculated that he had been held somewhere against his will, subjected to conditions that left psychological scars visible in his careful movements and sudden silences. Whatever the truth, it became apparent that his return did not resolve the mystery but deepened it, leaving the community to grapple not only with the initial disappearance but with the unsettling transformation of a familiar figure into someone whose presence inspired unease. The merchant's own family noticed peculiar behaviors that heightened their concern. He avoided the streets near the bell tower, seemingly fearful of its shadow, yet he sometimes lingered near other structures in ways that suggested a hidden compulsion or connection. At night, he would wake abruptly, speaking of sounds only he could hear, describing the tolling of bells in tones that seemed detached from the city's actual timekeeping. Sleep became restless for both him and those living with him, as the merchant's dreams, if they could be called that, echoed with unfamiliar patterns of sound and imagery. Shadows in corners appeared more prominent in his presence, and objects once fixed in place seemed to shift subtly, as if the environment itself recognized a changed consciousness within him. Local scholars, clergy, and curious townspeople were drawn to the returning merchant, eager to uncover any information that might explain both the disappearance and the bell's previous anomalies. He spoke sparingly, choosing words with extreme care, and even his recollections were fragmentary and abstract. He described corridors of mist, distant tolling that seemed to emanate from multiple directions at once, and the sensation of being guided or watched by invisible forces. The accounts were disjointed, yet they shared a common quality, the sense that time and space had been altered during his absence. Those who listened could not verify the details, and the merchant himself admitted that he had struggled to understand or articulate what had happened. The psychological impact extended beyond the merchant. Neighbors reported a growing sense of tension in the area surrounding his home, with the fog seeming denser and the streets quieter than usual. Animals avoided the threshold, children hesitated to play nearby, and even the wind carried a muted weight, as if the atmosphere itself were tuned to the presence of an altered consciousness. The merchant's interactions were marked by careful observation. He would pause mid-conversation, eyes tracing patterns invisible to others, as though consulting some hidden guide. Ordinary events, a passerby shouting a greeting, the distant clatter of a cart, the tolling of distant bells, elicited reactions that were measured but intense, a sign that his sensory perception had become extraordinarily sensitive or finely attuned to phenomena that eluded the uninitiated. The community, though relieved at his return, found themselves struggling to reconcile relief with apprehension. The bell tower, previously a backdrop to the disappearance, now appeared to influence the returnee in subtle but profound ways. Observers noted that his movements seemed synchronized with the faintest echoes of distant bells, as if some internal clock had been recalibrated. Patterns of behavior emerged that suggested an ongoing dialogue, invisible yet undeniable, between the merchant and forces centered around the tower. The phenomenon introduced an element of uncertainty. Even in his physical presence, the community could not fully grasp whether he had regained autonomy or whether some part of him remained under an unseen sway. Speculation ran rampant. Some townspeople believed he had glimpsed a hidden dimension, a layer of reality where time and causality were governed differently, and that his return represented only a partial reintegration into ordinary life. Others feared that the bell tower had left a lingering mark on him, a subtle possession that might influence others or perpetuate a cycle of anomalous occurrences. Clergy attempted to offer spiritual guidance, conducting prayers and minor rituals intended to purify the space and, if possible, release him from whatever unseen influence lingered. Despite these efforts, the merchant's behavior remained inconsistent, confirming the fears of skeptics and amplifying the fascination of believers. His work resumed, but nothing functioned as it had before. Transactions in the shop became slower, as if he were observing more than acting. He spoke less to colleagues, his eyes following patterns only he could perceive. Occasionally, he would pause, listening intently, before suddenly directing attention to distant streets or rooftops, as if some unseen signal had reached him. Customers found the interactions unsettling. Even the simplest exchange, a purchase of bread or cloth, felt imbued with a quiet tension. The physical presence of the man, once a source of stability, had become an indicator of the continuing influence of forces that were neither understood nor observable. Stories of his return spread beyond the immediate neighborhood. Merchants traveling between districts shared the account, and travelers passing through Prague added their own embellishments. The narrative transformed over time, blending the concrete details of his disappearance and return with speculation and myth. Yet at the core remained a disquieting truth: the merchant had returned, but he carried within him an unspoken connection to the bell tower, a reminder that the events of 1868 had left an enduring mark on both the individual and the city. Every toll of the bell, every shadow cast by the tower, and every murmur of the wind seemed to reinforce the idea that reality had shifted, even if only slightly, leaving the community to navigate a world in which the ordinary and the extraordinary coexisted uneasily. By the end of this chapter in Prague's unfolding story, it became clear that the return of the merchant did not signify closure. It marked a turning point, one in which the familiar became strange, the safe became uncertain, and the city was forced to contend with the persistent influence of forces it could neither see nor fully comprehend. The bell tower remained silent at times, but its presence, and the subtle but profound impact it had on the returning merchant, ensured that the city's rhythm would never be the same. Following the return of the merchant, a growing number of townspeople realized that the mystery of the bell tower could no longer be contained by fear or rumor alone. The unusual events had reached a point where observation and investigation were necessary. A group of individuals, comprising a local historian, a priest, a clockmaker familiar with the mechanisms of bells, and a handful of curious residents, decided to explore the origins and workings of the bell tower, hoping to uncover a rational explanation for the phenomena that had unsettled Prague. Their intentions were earnest, guided by both a desire for truth and a need to restore a sense of order to a city increasingly fraught with anxiety. The historian began by examining archival records, poring over documents that chronicled the tower's construction, its maintenance, and the families who had funded it. He traced the bell's lineage back several centuries, discovering inscriptions that detailed not only the artisans who forged it but also the rituals performed at its installation. According to these records, the bell had been consecrated with a complex ceremony meant to imbue it with both protective and spiritual qualities. While such practices were not uncommon in Prague, the historian noted that this particular bell had a reputation for its unusual tonal quality, described in older manuscripts as both resonant and uncanny, capable of stirring profound emotional responses. He speculated that these descriptions might hint at the cultural and psychological significance the bell held for the community, making it a central symbol of both faith and fear. The priest, who had accompanied the historian, approached the investigation from a spiritual perspective. He conducted blessings and observed the bell and its surroundings, documenting his impressions and noting subtle shifts in the atmosphere. According to his account, the air within the tower sometimes carried an almost tangible weight, as if imbued with the presence of unseen entities. He described a sensation of being observed and followed by something beyond mortal comprehension, even when the tower appeared empty. These experiences, while framed within the language of faith, added a layer of complexity to the investigation. The priest's observation suggested that the bell tower's influence might extend beyond the purely physical, touching the psychological and spiritual dimensions of those who ventured near it. The clockmaker provided a more technical perspective. He examined the bell's ropes, pulleys, and supporting structures, searching for any mechanical anomaly that could account for the unexplained tolling. His analysis was meticulous, every component was measured, tested, and compared to known standards of the period. The bell itself was carefully inspected, its bronze surface and mounting system scrutinized for flaws or damage. Despite his expertise, he found nothing that could explain the bell's autonomous movement. The weight, balance, and swing mechanics all appeared to function according to standard engineering principles. This absence of a mechanical explanation only deepened the sense of mystery, forcing the group to consider alternatives that ranged from the extraordinary to the supernatural. In addition to their formal investigation, the group conducted interviews with residents who had experienced the bell's anomalous behavior firsthand. The accounts were varied but consistently unsettling. People described faint echoes of tolling, objects moving inexplicably, and a pervasive feeling of being watched. Children spoke of shadowy figures, while adults reported dreams and sensations that seemed connected to the tower. These testimonies, when considered collectively, painted a picture of a phenomenon that affected not only the physical space around the bell tower but also the minds of those who lived in proximity to it. The group began to recognize patterns, subtle but recurring, that suggested an interaction between the bell and the emotional state of the community. As the investigation progressed, the group turned its attention to the architectural design of the tower itself. They noted that its height, materials, and structural layout might contribute to acoustic anomalies, potentially amplifying certain sounds or creating resonances that could be misinterpreted. However, even with this consideration, the timing and selectivity of the bell's tolling defied explanation. It appeared to respond to human activity, emotions, or presence in ways that could not be accounted for by sound physics alone. The historian and priest speculated that these effects might be a combination of cultural expectation, heightened sensitivity, and possibly unknown forces acting upon the structure, yet no definitive conclusion could be reached. The group's research revealed one particularly intriguing detail: the bell tower had been built atop a site with a complex history. Before the tower's construction, the land had been associated with a series of unexplained deaths and disappearances, recorded sporadically in parish records and city archives. While the events had been largely forgotten over time, the coincidence was difficult to ignore. The historian suggested that the bell might somehow be linked to the lingering memory of these past tragedies, a conduit through which the accumulated fear and grief of previous generations continued to resonate in the present. The priest, meanwhile, interpreted this as evidence that the site might be spiritually charged, an intersection between the living and the unseen that had persisted unnoticed for centuries. By mid-afternoon, the group's investigation had extended into the night. They spent hours in the tower, documenting the temperature, air movement, and faint vibrations in the structure. Observations were carefully recorded, yet no consistent, rational explanation emerged. Instead, they began to sense that the bell's influence was both subtle and pervasive. Even moments of silence carried the weight of expectation, as though the absence of sound itself were a signal. Members of the group reported increased heart rates, tingling sensations in their extremities, and a persistent awareness of being observed, all of which reinforced the notion that the bell tower exerted a psychological as well as physical presence. The townspeople, aware of the ongoing investigation, watched with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Some believed that understanding the bell's history and mechanics would restore order, while others feared that closer examination might provoke further disturbances. The duality of anticipation and dread created a charged atmosphere in the surrounding streets, where residents whispered about what might be discovered, and children avoided the tower, their instinctive fear of the unknown reinforced by the adults' own anxiety. Every toll of the distant bells, whether natural or perceived, seemed to heighten the collective tension, reminding the community that the mystery remained unresolved and that the bell tower's influence continued unabated. By the conclusion of this investigative period, it was clear that the bell's mysteries could not be contained by rational analysis alone. The historian, priest, and clockmaker had gathered a wealth of observations, yet the bell tower resisted explanation. Its effects were physical, psychological, and perhaps spiritual, interacting with the community in ways that blurred the boundaries between reality and perception. The investigations, though incomplete, established a framework for understanding the layered complexity of the phenomenon, offering both insight and new questions. The bell tower remained a focal point of fear, fascination, and speculation, a structure whose mysteries would continue to shape the city's experience for years to come, influencing both the living and the stories that they would tell about the events of 1868. As the investigation into the bell tower continued, the unsettling phenomena began to intensify, affecting more residents and reaching into aspects of life previously untouched. The bell, once an instrument of routine and ceremony, now assumed a darker presence, its tolling more frequent and ominous, echoing across the city in ways that seemed almost deliberate. People reported hearing it during quiet hours when no one could have rung it, its sound heavier and more resonant than before, as if the instrument itself were aware of the listener's proximity and emotional state. Even those who had dismissed earlier occurrences as coincidence now felt the weight of its presence pressing upon them, an almost sentient force quietly commanding attention. Residents closest to the tower described nights filled with subtle disturbances. Windows rattled without wind, shadows flickered where no light source existed, and faint footsteps echoed along corridors long after the streets had emptied. Some claimed to see figures near the tower at dusk, dark shapes that shifted between architectural outlines and human forms. Children were particularly sensitive to these occurrences, awakening suddenly from dreams filled with distant bell tolls and shadowy figures looming near their beds. Adults reported similar experiences, often waking with a chill and a sense of being watched. The atmosphere in the surrounding neighborhood grew tense, every creak and whisper interpreted as a signal, as though the city itself had become attuned to the tower's inexplicable behavior. Dreams and visions became a central part of the growing unease. Individuals recounted nights where the bell tolled in sync with moments of personal anxiety or dread. In these experiences, the tolling seemed to communicate directly with the subconscious, amplifying fears and creating vivid, sometimes disturbing imagery. Some reported being led to believe that the bell was guiding them towards certain locations or influencing decisions in subtle ways. Even rational observers found themselves doubting their senses, realizing that the psychological influence of the bell might be as significant as any physical anomaly. This blending of perception and reality intensified the sense of threat, as if the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural had become permeable. The social fabric of the affected neighborhoods began to fray. People became increasingly cautious, avoiding streets and alleyways near the bell tower at night. Gatherings in public spaces were shorter and quieter, conversation muted by an undercurrent of apprehension. Shops and markets remained open, but transactions were conducted with a new wariness. Merchants reported a subtle tension in the air that seemed to influence both mood and behavior. Fear, curiosity, and anticipation coalesced into a pervasive psychological climate, a collective sense that the ordinary rhythms of life were under surveillance by an unseen force. Even the simplest interactions, greeting a neighbor, buying bread, or walking through the foggy streets, were tinged with a sense of uncertainty. Witnesses spoke of a connection between the bell's tolling and human activity. It seemed to respond selectively, sounding after moments of emotional intensity, such as arguments, grief, or sudden realization. Some suggested that it was attuned to guilt or unresolved fear, an idea that blurred the line between rational explanation and superstition. The phenomenon was not violent or overtly threatening, yet it exerted a constant psychological pressure, shaping behavior and influencing decisions without any clear mechanism. Those most sensitive to the bell reported headaches, restless sleep, and a persistent feeling of unease that followed them throughout the day. The city's collective consciousness had become entwined with the tower, and every sound, shadow, and movement was now interpreted through the lens of its ongoing influence. Attempts to document and study the intensified phenomena yielded mixed results. Clergy, historians, and townspeople collaborated to record occurrences, carefully noting time, location, and the nature of each disturbance. Despite meticulous observation, no pattern emerged that could fully account for the bell's behavior. Mechanical failure was ruled out repeatedly, and natural causes, wind, structural vibrations, or acoustic reflections, were deemed insufficient to explain the selectivity and timing of the tolls. The more evidence accumulated, the more it suggested a combination of physical, psychological, and perhaps spiritual influence, an intersection of forces that could not be easily categorized or dismissed. The bell tower's growing notoriety drew the attention of more distant observers. Travelers and scholars passing through Prague remarked on the persistent rumors, adding layers of interpretation and embellishment to the story. Each account, while often inconsistent in detail, contributed to a shared narrative. The bell had become an agent of subtle terror, shaping perception and experience across the city. Even individuals previously unconcerned by superstition began to interpret ordinary events as signs, reinforcing a cycle of fear and anticipation. The bell's tolling, once merely a sound marking the hour, now carried moral, emotional, and almost sentient significance, influencing behavior in ways that resisted empirical explanation. Despite these intensifying effects, some residents attempted to maintain normalcy. Children were sent to school, merchants continued to trade, and life persisted amid the fog and shadows. Yet the bell's influence was unavoidable, a constant reminder that the familiar and the secure could be disrupted without warning. Its presence reshaped the city's social and psychological landscape, creating an environment in which fear and curiosity coexisted, each amplifying the other. The intensifying tolling and the reports of visions and subtle disturbances marked a new phase in the mystery, one in which the bell tower had shifted from a passive object of curiosity to an active agent in the lives of those who lived near it, setting the stage for deeper revelations and more profound consequences in the chapters to come. As the bell tower continued to exert its enigmatic influence, the city of Prague began to experience a subtle but undeniable transformation. Streets near the tower grew quieter, the hum of daily life giving way to an almost ritualistic observance of space and movement. Residents became hyper-aware of the tower's shadow, noting how it stretched and shifted with the sun, marking the hours in a way that felt almost deliberate. Even the light itself seemed altered, muted through fog or reflected in damp cobblestones, as if the environment were attuned to the bell's presence and reinforcing the emotional weight it imposed on the community. This growing awareness intensified both curiosity and fear, creating an atmosphere where ordinary events were imbued with extraordinary significance. One of the most troubling developments was the apparent behavioral influence the tower exerted on individuals. Witnesses reported that people living near it began to adjust their routines, consciously or unconsciously avoiding the streets and pathways most affected by its shadow. Errands were delayed, meetings postponed, and social gatherings shortened or cancelled. The rhythm of daily life, previously predictable, became punctuated by anticipation of the bell's tolls, with every sudden sound interpreted as a potential signal. This psychological ripple spread beyond those in immediate proximity, as merchants, travelers, and even distant observers became increasingly sensitive to reports of the tower's effects, amplifying the citywide perception of unease. Residents described the tolling itself with an intensity that suggested a dual nature. At times, it was melodic and distant, echoing faintly across rooftops and alleys, creating a sense of melancholy or nostalgia. At other moments, it resonated sharply, low and commanding, filling the streets with a vibration that seemed to press against the bones. Children became especially attuned to these tonal shifts, responding with sudden fear or reluctance to move about their homes. Adults reported headaches, vertigo, or sudden moments of disorientation, often coinciding with the tolling. The bell's influence was pervasive, shaping both perception and behavior in a way that suggested intentionality, even if its agency remained inscrutable. The psychological impact was compounded by a series of strange visual phenomena. Shadows appeared elongated and distorted near the tower, sometimes forming shapes that suggested figures or faces. Residents claimed to glimpse fleeting movements in alleys that, upon inspection, proved to be nothing tangible. Windows of homes nearest the tower reflected unfamiliar patterns of light and darkness, as if the city's very surfaces had become attuned to the bell's presence. Those who ventured out at dusk reported a sensation of being observed, a quiet awareness that their movements were under scrutiny. While no physical threat was present, the psychological pressure created a pervasive tension, blurring the line between imagination and reality. The local clergy became increasingly involved, attempting both spiritual and communal interventions to mitigate the tower's effects. Blessings were offered, prayers recited, and services held to appease any perceived spiritual unrest associated with the bell. Parishioners attended in large numbers, driven by both curiosity and fear, yet the tower's influence persisted. Some congregants reported feeling a pressure or vibration during prayers, a physical echo of the tolling that could not be attributed to ordinary acoustics. This led to debates among religious authorities regarding the nature of the tower's influence, whether it was a test of faith, a manifestation of lingering spiritual unrest, or something far beyond human comprehension. Historians and scholars continued their research, uncovering records that revealed the site's complex and sometimes troubling history. The land upon which the bell tower stood had been associated with unexplained deaths and disappearances over several generations, a series of events largely forgotten by the contemporary city. These findings gave weight to the theory that the tower's influence might be tied to residual energy or collective memory, a phenomenon in which historical trauma imprinted itself upon both space and human consciousness. The coincidence of these historical patterns with the current anomalies suggested that the tower acted as a focal point for events that transcended ordinary cause and effect, connecting the present to a long lineage of unresolved mysteries. Local residents, meanwhile, reported a heightened sense of vigilance. Those who lived near the tower spoke of instinctively pausing in their daily routines, sensing an unseen presence that seemed to respond to their movements. Children avoided certain streets altogether, and pets exhibited behaviors indicating fear or wariness near the tower. The social fabric of the neighborhood was subtly reshaped, with interpersonal interactions colored by the pervasive influence of the bell. Even ordinary human activities, walking to the market, conversing with neighbors, attending school, were affected by the anticipation of the tolling, creating a citywide awareness that life near the tower was never entirely ordinary. Despite growing anxiety, curiosity remained a powerful counterforce. Scholars, clergy, and investigators continued to study the tower, seeking insight into its construction, acoustics, and history. They examined the bell's metallurgy, tested its mechanical functions, and reviewed ancient rituals associated with its consecration. Their findings reinforced the complexity of the phenomenon. Mechanically, the bell was flawless; acoustically, it behaved according to expected laws of physics; historically, it carried a weight of superstition and spiritual significance. The combination of precise mechanics, historical resonance, and psychological impact created a layered mystery that defied simple explanation, ensuring that the bell tower would remain a source of fascination and unease. By the end of this period, the tower had established itself as more than a physical structure; it had become a symbol of the unknown, a presence that shaped perception, behavior, and emotional state. Its influence was subtle yet pervasive, a continuous reminder that even familiar surroundings could harbor forces beyond comprehension. The city's awareness of the bell, its tolling, and the historical echoes associated with the site created a narrative in which ordinary life and extraordinary phenomena existed side by side. Prague had been transformed, its citizens living in a state of heightened sensitivity to the interplay between sound, shadow, and history, anticipating that the tower's mysteries would continue to unfold with consequences yet unseen. As the months passed, the bell tower's influence over Prague became increasingly pronounced, extending beyond subtle psychological effects into incidents that were impossible to ignore. The city's residents began reporting a series of unusual events that seemed to revolve around the tower, as if its presence had begun to assert itself more directly on their lives. Ordinary activities, walking to markets, tending to shops, or moving through narrow alleyways, were now accompanied by heightened vigilance. People spoke of hearing faint tolls in the middle of the day, or shadows that shifted in unnatural ways even when the sun illuminated the streets. These disturbances were never overtly violent, yet the persistent sense of unease was impossible to dismiss. Witnesses described encounters that blurred the line between perception and reality. Merchants claimed to see fleeting figures on rooftops or within alleyways, shapes that vanished when approached. Children began refusing to play near the tower, often waking from sleep in a state of agitation, recounting dreams filled with mist, distant bells, and dark silhouettes that seemed to follow them. Adults experienced moments of vertigo or dizziness, often coinciding with the tolling, and reported a gnawing feeling of being watched, even in the privacy of their own homes. Such experiences, widespread across the neighborhood, began to shape a collective consciousness wherein the bell tower was no longer a backdrop to life but an active participant in the city's atmosphere. Stories of the tolling's timing grew more precise and eerie. It seemed to respond to events in the city, echoing moments of tension, grief, or personal anxiety. A heated argument in a household might be followed by a toll that reverberated down the streets, while a sudden illness or misfortune would coincide with a resonance that could be heard blocks away. Even those who had previously dismissed the phenomenon could not ignore these apparent patterns. The bell's influence appeared selective, aware, and responsive, creating a feedback loop that tied human emotion to the resonances of its bronze surface. Observers began to speak in hushed tones of the bell's intelligence, a notion that, while alarming, reflected the consistent and inexplicable nature of its tolling. Local authorities, initially skeptical, were drawn into the growing tension. Guards patrolling the area reported unusual acoustic patterns, shadows that did not conform to natural light, and moments where the air itself seemed charged with anticipation. Investigations revealed no mechanical faults, no deliberate acts of mischief, and no signs of human manipulation. The clockwork of the bell tower was precise, the mechanisms operating exactly as intended, yet the occurrences persisted in ways that defied empirical explanation. Scholars, priests, and townspeople alike were forced to acknowledge that the tower's influence was more than mechanical; it had become a psychological and social force that shaped perception, behavior, and even memory. Families living closest to the tower described the subtle erosion of daily normalcy. Routine tasks became exercises in caution, as the bell's tolling seemed to align with moments of emotional vulnerability. Children developed new fears, avoiding certain streets or rooms, and adults began altering their daily paths to reduce exposure to its shadow. Even animals reacted. Dogs barked at corners where nothing appeared to exist, and cats refused to enter specific rooms. The tower had, in essence, created a microcosm of anxiety, where the ordinary rhythms of life were dictated by the timing of a sound, a shadow, or an unseen presence. This effect extended beyond the immediate vicinity, influencing neighborhoods farther afield as stories, rumors, and indirect experiences propagated through the city. Observers began documenting not just the timing but also the effects of the bell's tolling, noting correlations between emotional intensity and its resonance. Patterns emerged in anecdotal accounts. Tolls coincided with moments of guilt, grief, or fear, children's dreams aligned with the bell's peals, and neighborhoods nearest the tower exhibited heightened levels of anxiety. Clergy interpreted these observations spiritually, suggesting that the bell had become a conduit between the living and the unseen, a medium through which human emotion and lingering historical events could interact. Scholars, in contrast, sought rational explanations, examining acoustics, vibration, and local geology, but no purely scientific rationale could account for the selectivity and precision of the phenomena. The combination of psychological, social, and historical factors created a feedback loop that intensified the bell tower's influence. Awareness of the phenomena heightened sensitivity to subtle cues, which in turn amplified the perception of anomalies. Every footstep, every distant echo, and every shadow was now interpreted through the lens of the bell's presence. The community's collective consciousness became intertwined with the tower, producing a pervasive sense of apprehension that influenced behavior, decisions, and even dreams. What began as subtle anxiety had evolved into a shared experience of suspense, anticipation, and existential uncertainty, binding the city to the mysteries of the tower. Despite the growing tension, curiosity remained a powerful motivator. Scholars, investigators, and even casual observers continued to study the bell and its tower, hoping to identify patterns or discover explanations. Each investigation uncovered layers of historical significance, from the construction techniques used to the consecration rituals performed centuries earlier. Accounts of past disappearances, deaths, and inexplicable occurrences were collected, reinforcing the notion that the tower was a nexus of human and historical experience. Its influence was now multidimensional, mechanical, psychological, historical, and possibly spiritual, a convergence that defied simplistic categorization. By the end of this period, it was evident that the bell tower had become far more than a landmark. It was a presence, an actor within the city, and a force whose influence extended into the lives, emotions, and perceptions of those who lived in its shadow. Fear, anticipation, and curiosity intertwined, ensuring that the mystery of the tolling would continue to shape the narrative of Prague. The city's inhabitants had been irrevocably drawn into the orbit of the tower, bound by patterns they could sense but not fully comprehend, and aware that the enigma of the bell had only begun to reveal its full impact. The persistent presence of the bell tower had begun to permeate the city's collective consciousness in ways that were subtle yet undeniable. As weeks turned into months, the residents of Prague found themselves navigating a world in which ordinary routines were constantly interrupted by the tolling that seemed to echo not just through streets but into their very thoughts. Even those who had initially dismissed the phenomena as coincidence began to feel the psychological weight of its influence. Shops opened more slowly, children hesitated to leave their homes, and adults found themselves glancing repeatedly at the tower, attuned to sounds that might signify a warning or an omen. The tower's presence had transformed from a simple landmark into a symbol of both vigilance and dread. Local families reported that life around the tower was increasingly dictated by anticipation. Daily schedules shifted to avoid the hours when the tolling was most frequent, and minor disputes often coincided with moments when the bell echoed across the city. One family recounted how, during a particularly heated argument, the bell tolled 3 times in rapid succession, leaving them paralyzed with a sense of foreboding. Such incidents were repeated throughout the neighborhood, establishing a correlation between heightened emotional states and the bell's resonance. The effect was not physical harm but psychological pressure, a constant, invisible presence shaping behavior, choices, and even the perception of reality. Travelers passing through Prague took note of the peculiar atmosphere. Merchants, scholars, and visitors reported a strange tension in the air near the tower, describing the streets as unusually quiet, almost ritualistic in their emptiness during certain hours. Some recounted witnessing shadows that moved independently of natural light, while others heard faint tolls that seemed to emanate from nowhere, carrying a resonance that lingered long after the sound ceased. These observations, though anecdotal, reinforced the growing awareness that the bell tower exerted an influence that transcended the purely physical, extending into perception, emotion, and memory. Investigators attempting to study the bell discovered patterns that further deepened the mystery. They found that the tolling did not adhere to any conventional schedule, yet it often corresponded to moments of stress, grief, or intense focus within the community. A merchant counting coins, a mother consoling a frightened child, or a scholar poring over documents might trigger a toll heard blocks away. These correlations were too consistent to be dismissed as coincidence, yet no mechanism could be identified. The bell, precise in its construction and function, remained mechanically flawless, suggesting that its influence was neither accidental nor entirely physical. It had, in essence, become a psychological instrument, resonating with the emotions of those within earshot. The clergy attempted to intervene, offering prayers, blessings, and protective rituals in the hopes of alleviating the tension. Congregants gathered regularly, yet the bell continued to toll at unpredictable intervals, undermining the perception that human action could control its behavior. Some parishioners reported feeling pressure or vibrations in their bodies during services, subtle but persistent sensations that reinforced the sense that the tower was exerting influence in ways beyond understanding. Even those with strong faith could not fully reconcile the ongoing psychological weight with the mechanics of their religious rituals, creating a space where spirituality, superstition, and unexplained phenomena intersected. Historical records uncovered additional layers to the bell tower's mystery. Researchers found accounts of disappearances, deaths, and unexplained events occurring on the same site centuries prior to the current disturbances. These patterns suggested that the location itself carried a legacy of unresolved events, a history of emotional and physical upheaval that may have left a lingering imprint on both the structure and the people nearby. The bell tower, in this context, became not only a witness to history but also a vessel through which historical trauma interacted with the present. Its tolling seemed to bridge centuries, carrying the weight of events that no living person had witnessed yet which continued to shape perception and behavior. Residents increasingly spoke of the psychological toll. Anxiety, restlessness, and heightened vigilance became commonplace, with many adjusting their lives to accommodate the bell's unpredictable influence. Children avoided the tower, adults hesitated to traverse certain streets, and pets reacted with visible unease. Even seemingly mundane activities, such as shopping or attending school, were influenced by the persistent anticipation of the tolling. The city had entered a new rhythm, a shared consciousness that acknowledged the tower's presence as both a physical and psychological force, and whose influence would continue to shape life in Prague for the foreseeable future. By the end of this period, it was clear that the bell tower had evolved beyond mere architecture or historical artifact. It had become a locus of psychological influence, a force shaping perception, emotion, and community behavior. Its tolling was no longer simply a sound marking the hour but a resonant signal that connected individuals to a shared sense of tension, expectation, and unease. The city had been irrevocably altered, its collective experience bound to the tower, ensuring that the mysteries it held would continue to affect both the living and the stories they told, long after the echoes of its tolls faded from immediate awareness. As the bell tower continued to dominate the psychological landscape of Prague, the city began to experience a slow but unmistakable erosion of normalcy. The once familiar streets now carried an undercurrent of tension, as residents moved with caution, their senses attuned to every distant sound, every shifting shadow. The tolling, unpredictable and resonant, seemed to extend its influence into every corner of life, altering perception and shaping behavior without physical coercion. Ordinary events, children playing, merchants conducting business, neighbors conversing, were filtered through an awareness of the tower's persistent presence, creating a shared anxiety that was both invisible and inescapable. People closest to the tower began reporting more intense psychological disturbances. Insomnia became common, with nights punctuated by dreams of the tower rising in fog, bells tolling in tones both beautiful and foreboding. Sleep brought no relief, as the tolling seemed to echo within minds as vividly as it did through the streets. Residents described a sensation of being observed, an awareness that an unseen intelligence was monitoring their actions. Some attempted to ignore these feelings, convincing themselves of coincidence or imagination, yet the consistency and intensity of experiences made doubt nearly impossible. The bell tower had become not only a landmark but an omnipresent force in the daily consciousness of those living nearby. Stories circulated of people attempting to confront or understand the influence more directly. One family reported placing themselves near the tower at dawn, hoping to observe the tolling and demystify it. They witnessed shadows moving in ways that seemed independent of natural light, and faint vibrations in the air coincided with moments of emotional tension among themselves. Attempts at rational explanation, acoustic interference, wind currents, or structural vibrations, failed to account for the specificity and timing of these experiences. Each observation reinforced the perception that the bell tower operated according to a set of principles beyond ordinary understanding, interacting with human emotion and collective awareness. The clergy, though initially more confident in spiritual explanations, began to report that traditional interventions offered only partial relief. Prayers and blessings seemed to calm the immediate vicinity temporarily, yet the tolling persisted, sometimes intensifying after ritual observances. Some parishioners claimed to feel vibrations or weight in their bodies during services, experiences that could not be rationalized but added to the pervasive sense that the tower exerted influence in ways beyond ordinary comprehension. The tension between faith and reason became a recurring theme in Prague, as both spiritual and rational authorities struggled to account for the persistent effects of the bell. Children, particularly sensitive to subtle changes in environment and sound, were among the most affected. Many refused to play near streets or alleys adjacent to the tower, often waking in the middle of the night from dreams filled with fog, distant tolling, and shadowy figures. Adults described similar experiences, reporting vivid imagery, heightened anxiety, and disorientation coinciding with the bell's resonance. Even pets reacted unusually, displaying fear or hesitancy in areas surrounding the tower. The cumulative effect was a transformation of the city's social and psychological environment, where anticipation of the bell's tolls dictated behavior, subtly altering daily routines, interactions, and communal life. Historical research into the site revealed layers of unresolved events, many of which mirrored the current disturbances. Records detailed previous disappearances, unexplained deaths, and instances of widespread anxiety connected to the location over several centuries. These historical echoes suggested that the tower was more than a structure, it functioned as a focal point for the residual energy of past events, interacting with both the physical and psychological dimensions of the present. This understanding deepened the sense of unease, as residents realized that the bell tower had long been associated with inexplicable phenomena, and that their experiences were part of a larger continuum. By this stage, the bell tower had become an unavoidable aspect of life in Prague. Its influence was subtle yet pervasive, shaping not only perception and behavior but also collective consciousness. The city had entered a state in which ordinary routines were inseparable from the anticipation of the tolling, where shadows, echoes, and historical resonance combined to create a persistent, living presence. Residents understood that the tower's mystery would not be easily resolved, and its effects would continue to shape the social and psychological fabric of Prague, leaving a legacy that intertwined history, perception, and fear in ways that would endure long after any single toll had faded.